Divorced CEO trapped on a private island falls in love with the maid who imprisoned his heart forever. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. A lone seaplane cut through the sky, carrying a man whose thoughts were clouded with regret and exhaustion. Donovan Cross, once celebrated as the unstoppable, dashing CEO of a multinational hotel conglomerate, stared out the tiny window at the endless stretch of turquoise ocean. These days, that silver felt less like a mark of distinguished age and more like a reminder of how life could wear a person down. The official reason for his trip was an urgent need to unplug and recharge in the secluded luxury of his company's exclusive island resort. But the truth was more complicated. His divorce had been finalized just weeks before. No scandal or wild headlines had broken out, just the official stamp of a marriage that had eroded over the years. Rumors circulated that Donovan's ex-wife had taken a portion of his fortune. Others whispered that he was the one who left her after some unspecified betrayal. Whatever the cause, the press lingered like vultures on the scent of gossip, waiting for any new morsel of drama to feed their headlines. Donovan simply wanted to disappear, if only for a few days. He tried to relax as the plane bumped over a current of air, yet the tension in his body told another story. He pinched the bridge of his nose, remembering the CFO's warning about the company's slipping shares and the ways the board seemed to be turning against him. His personal matters had not only damaged his heart, but they also threatened his reputation as a business leader. Distraction was not an option. This trip to the private island, his own company's gem, was part damage control, part personal retreat. A jolt announced their descent. Donovan glanced out the window to see the turquoise waters sparkling beneath the midday sun, a beautiful deception hinting at paradise. The island's pristine white sand beaches curved around lush green jungle. A single dock extended from a hidden cove where a small motorboat awaited his arrival. Already he could imagine the paparazzi in some corner of the world speculating about his every move. Would they claim he was running from responsibility, or that he was hunting down some new romantic fling? At the dock, the pilot helped Donovan step onto the creaking wooden planks. The humidity enveloped him immediately, and he reflexively pulled at the collar of his expensive linen shirt. The caretaker assigned to greet him was nowhere in sight. Only the quiet rustle of palm fronds and the distant hush of waves filled the air. Donovan exhaled and noted with annoyance that the staff must be losing their efficiency. He'd have to talk to the resort manager about that. He began the short trek up the narrow dirt path that led to the main complex of bungalows, each hidden behind manicured tropical foliage. Although these bungalows were ordinarily for select VIP guests, Donovan's ownership gave him free rein, and he intended to use that advantage. No front desk formalities, no forced smiles from staff wanting tips, just a vow of solitude. He discovered that vow would be broken sooner than he expected. A single figure rounded the corner of the walkway, nearly colliding with him. She let out a startled gasp. A slender young woman with dark hair secured in a neat ponytail struggled to balance a stack of fresh towels that threatened to topple out of her arms. She wore the uniform of the island's housekeeping staff, simple and modest, made of crisp white cotton designed for the hot climate. On the left pocket, embroidered in subtle gold, was the name Carmen. I'm sorry, sir," she managed, breathless. "I didn't see you coming around the bend." Donovan took a half step back, eyes narrowed. In the past, he might have barked at an employee to watch where they were going, but something in her wide, apologetic eyes kept his temper in check. "It's fine," he said curtly, stepping to the side. "Where's the resort manager?" Carmen struggled to steady the towels. He went to the mainland this morning, sir. He was supposed to be back before you arrived." "Should have known better than to expect punctuality," Donovan muttered, casting a glance over her uniform. "Are you housekeeping?" "Yes, sir," she said with a small nod. "If you'd like, I can direct you to your bungalow. I know which one has been prepared for you." A wisp of dark hair escaped her ponytail, and she brushed it aside. He noticed that behind her momentary nervousness, there was a calm sincerity in her voice. "That's fine. Lead the way," he replied. "I want to settle in and make sure the staff gets the message that I'm not to be disturbed unless there's a matter of life or death." Carmen swallowed and gave a single nod of confirmation. She turned and led him further down the winding path. En route, Donovan found himself studying the resort's state. The pathways looked somewhat overgrown, and he caught glimpses of chipped paint on certain bungalows. It seemed the high standards he'd once insisted on had been slipping in his absence. Eventually, they arrived at a relatively secluded bungalow perched atop a gentle rise with broad windows that faced the sea. While he wasn't expecting fanfare, Donovan was surprised that no one else was present to carry his bags or greet him. The short walkway to the front door was scattered with fallen palm fronds that nobody had bothered to sweep away. "Here we are," Carmen announced softly. She set the towels on a small shelf near the entrance. "Will you need anything else right away, sir?" He exhaled slowly, stepping into the living space. It was a large room with a vaulted ceiling of woven palm leaves, a polished wood floor, and a few pieces of tasteful furniture that evoked the island's tropical vibe. Though slightly dusty, it was still mesmerizing in its open-air design. Windows designed to draw in breezes, and a wide veranda offering unobstructed ocean views. He turned back to her. "When the manager returns," he said, carefully maintaining a calm tone, "tell him I expect a full report on the staff's performance and I'd like the path outside cleared. Understood?" She nodded, her expression betraying no offense or surprise at his request. "I'll relay the message, sir." With that, she turned to leave, but paused as though uncertain whether to say something. Finally, she opened her mouth, then hesitated. "Sir, there's been a forecast of severe storms for the next few days. If there's any time you plan to travel back to the mainland, it might be safer to do so soon." Donovan frowned, glancing at the sky through the large windows. Streaks of cloud began to cloak the intense sun, suggesting a shift in weather. "Storms, you say?" She nodded. "Yes, sir. We're not entirely sure how bad it will get, but the supply plane from the main island was cancelled earlier. You might want to keep that in mind if you're planning to leave." He felt the weight of her words, but shrugged. "I'll be fine." Carmen pursed her lips, not pressing the matter. Then, with a polite bow of her head, she turned and slipped back down the path, leaving Donovan alone. He released a slow breath and walked over to the veranda doors. The ocean remained calm, but the horizon was beginning to darken, as if a distant storm was brewing. For a moment, he let his shoulders relax, reveling in the hush. No blaring horns, no office phones ringing off the hook, no dreadful silence of his empty penthouse. He told himself he had come here to rejuvenate. However, the intangible weight of his crumbling marriage and battered self-worth refused to let him rest. There he stood, a man with wealth and status, yet he felt more like a lost traveler in an unknown land. He thought of the housekeeper, Carmen, with her gentle voice and cautious eyes. Was she yet another person simply tiptoeing around him, terrified of losing her job if she said the wrong thing? Or was there something more genuine in her manner? Someone who might see Donovan cross, not the famed CEO, but the tired, hurting man behind the name? Shaking off the thought, he dropped onto a sofa. The warm breeze drifting through the open windows lulled him into a half-doze. The lonely hush of the island resonated with him, an unspoken promise of both isolation and hidden potential for renewal. Outside, clouds thickened, a sign of the coming storm. Little did Donovan know that the heavens were about to shut every possible door, quite literally trapping him on this remote bit of paradise. He was oblivious to the improbable connection that fate was preparing, the embittered, divorced mogul and the unassuming maid whose job it was to tidy the corners of the very empire he controlled. In that interplay of threat and wonder, he couldn't guess how the island itself would become both a sanctuary and a crucible. forging bonds neither breakable by storm nor undone by the scars of betrayal. All he could do for the moment was watch the clouds gather, feeling the distant rumble of thunder that seemed to echo the turmoil within his own heart. Late afternoon brought low-hanging clouds that slowly choked out the sun, casting the island in an eerie half-light. Donovan Cross stood on the veranda of his bungalow, staring out at a sky that threatened chaos. The wind teased at the palm fronds, and an occasional thunderous rumble pressed at the horizon. He thought back to the housekeeper, Carmen, mentioning storms on the forecast. He'd brushed off her warning, but now the proof was in the air. The stifling humidity, the thickening gray above, the sudden lull of wildlife. Donovan turned and stepped into his bungalow's open living space. Even though it wasn't dusty in the usual sense, some staff had clearly prepared it, there was still a sense of neglect throughout the resort. He thought of the unkempt walkway, the untrimmed foliage on the path he'd traveled earlier, and the stark emptiness of the property. This place was supposed to be one of his company's crown jewels, an exclusive getaway for the world's wealthiest travelers. What he found instead was a skeleton staff and a manager who couldn't be bothered to greet him. He grabbed his phone, intending to call the corporate office on the mainland for an update. The device displayed only the faintest signal, a single flickering bar of service. Annoyed, Donovan tried to dial, only for the call to fail. He repeated the attempt, pacing in frustration, but the result was the same. The storm's electromagnetic interference, plus the island's remote location, had cut him off from the world. Typical, he thought. Perfect time for nature to make sure he was truly alone. A light knock at the door startled him. Donovan opened it to find Carmen standing there holding a covered tray. She gave a polite, tentative smile and said, "Apologies for interrupting, sir. I brought dinner. The kitchen staff is small, but they asked me to make sure you have a hot meal." Despite his sour mood, Donovan managed to accept the tray with a nod. He noticed a subtle exhaustion lining her features, as though she'd been doing more than her share of chores. "Thank you," he said tersely. Then, aware of how abrupt he'd sounded, he softened his voice. "Has the manager returned?" "No, sir," she replied. "In fact, we haven't heard from him." Donovan felt his temper stir. "Is he typically gone this long?" Carmen exhaled. "Not usually, but it's been happening more often these last months. Sometimes he leaves supplies half-ordered or entire tasks to the rest of us. He claims corporate hasn't sent enough workers. Says the budget keeps getting cut." Donovan's jaw tightened. So that explained the state of the place. The manager's absentee behavior, combined with budget constraints and minimal staffing, was hurting the resort. "I see," he muttered. "And who's running things while he's off wherever he pleases?" Carmen gave a small, rueful smile. "Well, I guess we just manage. The head of housekeeping tries to keep the bungalows in order, but she's been ill. The groundskeeper does what he can, and I try to help guests feel welcome." A sudden flash of worry passed over her features. "But with you here, sir, I'm sure we'll get back on track." Donovan studied her, trying to decide if there was any sarcasm in that statement. None. Her expression was entirely earnest. "I'm only here for a short while," he said with a sigh, setting the dinner tray on a nearby table. "And I doubt I'll solve your staffing crisis alone. But I'll see that the person responsible answers for it." Carmen lowered her gaze, as if uncertain whether to thank him. Then she managed a polite nod. "I hope so." Thunder cracked outside, louder this time. A wave of wind rustled the leaves across the bungalow's veranda. Carmen hesitated, noticing Donovan's nearly empty living area. "Sir, if you'd like, I can bring candles or additional lanterns, in case the storm knocks the power out." Donovan eyed her for a moment, then shrugged. That might be wise. He wasn't eager to fumble around in the dark. "But before you go, what's your name?" She blinked. "Oh, of course. Carmen, sir. Carmen Alvarez." I remember seeing it on your uniform, he said. Thank you for the meal, Carmen. She gave a tight smile. Yes, sir. I'll get those lanterns. As she slipped out into the thickening dusk, Donovan found himself uncharacteristically unsettled. Usually he took staff for granted, faceless employees paid to do their jobs. But Carmen's quiet competence and gentle demeanor struck him, especially when he recalled her mention of making guests feel welcome. Here she was, one of the few employees actually present, taking on responsibilities that clearly weren't hers alone. He wondered if she knew who he really was, the CEO behind the entire operation. Then again, he reasoned, how could she not? He pushed aside the thought and lifted the tray's cover. The aroma of fresh fish, lightly seasoned with island spices, curled into his senses. For a moment, he just savored the smell. When was the last time he'd sat down to a meal cooked specifically for him without the oppressive weight of a business deal or a plastic-smiled hostess at a high-end restaurant? He realized he couldn't recall. Eager for nourishment, he sank into a nearby chair. Outside, the wind whistled a plaintive note. Rain started to patter on the bungalow's thatched roof. Donovan ate in silence, forcing himself to relish each bite. The fish was tender, served with grilled vegetables. This was good, better than he expected, given the limited staff. Maybe if the world spun in a kinder direction, he could send some small bonus to the kitchen crew for managing so well under these conditions. Lightning flickered over the ocean horizon, followed almost instantly by a booming clap of thunder that rattled the bungalow's windows. Donovan set his fork down, concern pricking at the edges of his mind. That was close. He rose from his seat and walked to the veranda doors, stepping out into the swirling wind. The entire world felt electric, charged with tension. The seascape had turned ominous, the once clear turquoise now a churning gray. Waves pounded the shore, and the palms shook under the onslaught of gusts. He felt a drop in temperature too, a moist chill that clung to his skin. He realized belatedly that if the storm grew worse, flights out might be canceled. Possibly the small boats too. A flicker of memory returned. Carmen's gentle warning about traveling back soon. He set his jaw, refusing to let the creeping worry consume him. He'd weather this storm. Perhaps it was exactly what he needed, a literal tempest to match the emotional turmoil inside. Recalling that he still had half a meal waiting, Donovan started back inside. That was when the first lights blinked out. It started in the distance, across the resort's grounds, where he spotted the warm glow of path lighting. Then the bulbs illuminating the lush walkways darkened, leaving only the faint reflection of lightning flashes. Finally, the lights within his own bungalow gave a final flicker, plunging him into near darkness. He sighed. So the power was out. Carmen had predicted this might happen. With deliberate steps, Donovan made his way across the living area. His eyes were still adjusting to the sudden gloom, so he bumped a hip painfully against the edge of a small table. Cursing under his breath, he steadied himself. As if on cue, there was a timid knock. He opened the door to find Carmen again, this time clutching a small crate of lanterns and candles. Her dark ponytail was damp from the storm, and water dripped off the sleeves of her uniform. The lights just went out across the property, she said breathlessly, stepping in. I'm sorry, it's just as we suspected. Donovan nodded, relieved she had come prepared. The faint reflection of lightning illuminated her face, showing both her resolve and a trace of fear at nature's violence. Thank you for bringing these, he said. I guess we'd better get some light in here before we go stumbling all over. Carmen set the crate down, rummaging for a lighter. Soon, a flickering glow cast dancing shadows on the bungalow walls. She arranged 2 lanterns near the windows, while Donovan lit a few pillar candles. It transformed the space into a softly lit refuge amidst the wind and pounding rain. I'll head back soon, she explained, though there was a faint tremor in her words. I need to check on the other guests. We don't have many, but a few bungalows are occupied by honeymooners who arrived yesterday. He glanced at the storm outside. Wait, you're going to go back out there? In this? Carmen looked over her shoulder. I have a job to do, sir. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Arguing with her sense of duty felt misplaced, especially when he'd demanded so much from staff all his life. Be careful, he said finally. She offered a small, reassuring smile. I will. Then, in a softer tone, she added, if the storm gets worse and you need anything, there's an intercom phone by the front desk that might still work on the resort's generator, but I'm not sure how reliable it'll be. He arched a brow. The manager doesn't have a backup plan for an island storm? She shifted uncomfortably. He did at one point, but there's been trouble with maintenance, and there's talk that the generator's not in good shape. Donovan snorted, exasperated. Of course. Well, hopefully it holds up enough to keep us from utter blackout. She gathered her courage, drawing a long breath. Sir, I know you're probably used to better accommodations, but we'll do everything in our power to keep you comfortable, I promise. Before he could reply, another thunderclap shook the bungalow, causing the lantern lights to waver. Carmen excused herself, stepping out into the tempest. Donovan watched her figure vanish into the night. For a moment he thought to follow, to insist she stay under shelter until the worst of the rain passed. But then she was gone, and his will to chase her into the swirling dark receded. He closed the door behind her and stood in the flickering light of the candles. Each roll of thunder hammered at his composure. The last time he'd been cut off from the world, ironically, it might have been before his marriage, decades ago. He was a striver then, traveling to remote corners of the globe to strike new deals. Before the success, before the heartbreak, he actually relished the freedom of being unreachable. Now, it felt lonely. Lightning lit the entire bungalow for a split second, revealing the open windows to the night's fury. Raindrops drove sideways, splattering through the screen. Donovan hurried to close the shutters. The air cooled, the wind rose, and he realized that this might be no ordinary tropical squall. The storm was violent, hungry. Under the trembling lantern glow, Donovan settled onto a sofa, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands. The black emptiness of the island pressed in. For once, he had no urgent texts or emails calling for his attention, no spouse waiting at home, no business partners to update. Here, he was alone with the raging elements, forced to confront the swirling chaos within himself. Outside, thunder roared. He wondered fleetingly what Carmen was facing at that moment. Was she safe, or battling the gale to reach other guests in time? He thought about the vulnerability in her expression and how little he actually knew of her situation or that of the resort. Maybe, just maybe, his intrusion here would serve some purpose. He'd vowed to mend the fractures in his personal life. Perhaps it was time to mend what was broken in his business too. Another lightning strike illuminated the veranda, followed by a crack of thunder so explosive it seemed to rattle the foundation. Donovan stood, heart pounding. He told himself it was just a storm, but he couldn't quiet the uneasy feeling that an unstoppable force was trapping him on this island, a place that was fast becoming his only refuge, and that, in turn, might reveal more truth than he was prepared to face. Rain battered the bungalow's windows, each gust of wind rattling the shutters. Donovan Cross reached to close a final latch, his fingers stumbling in the flickering lantern light. While the howling outside threatened to lift the roof clean off, he fought a private turmoil within. He had weathered corporate battles and soared to unimaginable heights in the business world, but standing here against the wild forces of nature reminded him how small even the greatest empire could be. Despite the chaos, he forced himself to focus. The staff was minimal, the manager AWOL, and the entire resort seemed vulnerable to the fury of the storm. Donovan could almost hear the furious swirl of ocean waves slamming the shoreline just out of view. He tried his phone again, but as expected, there was no signal. The only hope might be the ancient generator or the shortwave radio at the front desk, if those even worked. A resonant crack of thunder reverberated overhead, making him flinch. Determined to maintain composure, he ran a hand through his dark hair. He noticed how the candlelight caught the silver threads at his temples, a stark reminder of how the last few months had aged him. The ordeal of his divorce and the subsequent meltdown of his personal life had sapped him of the confidence he used to carry so effortlessly. Movement at the door startled him. He turned to see Carmen, dripping from head to toe, her uniform soaked through. She held a small walkie-talkie in one hand, water beading on its plastic casing. "Carmen?" Donovan said, stepping forward. "I thought you left to check on the other guests." She nodded, water trickling down her cheeks. "I did. They're fine for now. A young couple on their honeymoon and another small family. They have enough candles and they're holed up until the storm settles." Her gaze flicked across the dimly lit bungalow, making sure Donovan was similarly safe. "But I realized this walkie-talkie might help us coordinate. The phone lines are out across the property." Donovan gestured for her to come in. "You're soaking wet. You shouldn't be out in this weather." Carmen offered a tired but grateful smile and stepped inside. He grabbed a spare towel from the supply shelf and handed it to her. She dabbed at her face and arms, never quite meeting his eyes. The storm hammered the roof above, wind shrieking past the bungalow's corners like a warning cry from nature itself. "I'll be okay, sir," she said softly, though her voice trembled slightly from the cold. "Just wanted to be sure you have a means to reach me or any of the staff in case the situation gets worse." Donovan took the walkie-talkie from her outstretched hand, turning it over. "Thank you. That's very resourceful." She nodded again. "We found a set of these in the storage room last month. The manager didn't say much about them, but they work on short-range radio frequencies. Should help us stay in contact." Outside, lightning revealed the veranda in a split-second flash, illuminating the sheets of rain that lashed the island. Donovan's eyes flicked toward the shuttered windows, dread forming in the pit of his stomach. This was more than a passing squall. It had the hallmarks of a full-blown tropical storm, maybe a hurricane. And if so, they were terribly unprepared. "Do you think anyone else might be trapped here?" he asked, lowering his voice as though the storm might overhear. Carmen wrung the towel in her hands, gaze dropping. "I'm not sure. Typically we see small day tourists, private day charters, or guests who arrive on seaplanes for exclusive weekends. But with the weather warnings, I'd guess no new arrivals came in after you." He felt a pang of guilt. Everyone had told him not to come, or at least to keep an eye on the weather. Even the pilot of his seaplane looked uneasy when he'd insisted on landing. Now Donovan might have inadvertently stranded himself and perhaps Carmen and the other staff on this island, with limited resources and a manager who'd conveniently vanished. In the faint light of the lanterns, Donovan studied the lines of worry etched into Carmen's features. He recognized that expression, the determined calm of someone used to bearing responsibility they never asked for. With a soft sigh, he murmured, "Sit down for a moment. Catch your breath." Surprise flickered across her face. "But sir, it's not—" "Please," he said firmly, gesturing to the small armchair near the sofa. "We won't get through this storm if we're all exhausted. Take a minute, then you can go if you must." Reluctantly, she sank into the armchair, the wet fabric of her uniform clinging to her. She still held the damp towel, fidgeting with its edges. For a moment, they listened to the wind moan around the bungalow, the roof creaking as if under strain. Donovan found the walkie-talkie's power button and flicked it on. Static hissed. No voices came through. "So," he said, clearing his throat, "you mentioned a family staying here plus a honeymoon couple. Are we talking about a total of, 6 or 7 guests in all?" "About that, yes," Carmen confirmed. "There's the one family of 3, the newlyweds, and you. The rest canceled when the weather warning went out days ago." She offered a rueful shrug. "If the manager had stayed, we might have had a better evacuation plan, but that's not how it turned out." He mulled that over. Why do you think he left? The timing is suspect. A flash of something like disappointment crossed her face. I really don't know. He's been unpredictable for a while now. I guess he never expected a major storm to roll in so quickly. Donovan felt a spike of anger. Anger at the manager's irresponsibility. Anger at himself for letting the resort get to this state. He was, after all, the top figure in the entire operation. That meant the final blame lay at his feet. Carmen, he said, inhaling slowly. Has it always been this chaotic here? Or have things changed recently? She hesitated, carefully folding the towel over her lap. I've only worked here a year and a half, but from what I understand, the island used to run like clockwork, fully staffed, well-maintained, with a manager who actually cared. Then money got tight. The budgets were slashed. Some staff left when their wages were reduced. Others were reassigned. And now we have this skeleton crew that can barely keep up with basic maintenance, let alone emergencies. He felt an embarrassing twist of guilt. Corporate had been urging cost-saving measures across all properties, especially the smaller, more niche resorts that didn't generate massive profit margins. He'd approved them. Granted, he never meant them to compromise safety or degrade the guest experience, but perhaps in the hands of incompetent local management, cost-cutting had gone too far. A silence fell. Thunder crashed again. Candlelight flickered, dancing shadows along the walls. Carmen's gaze was pinned to a swirl of water dripping from her sleeve, but Donovan knew she was aware of his presence and the tension that hovered between them. It must have been difficult, he said gently, to stay and shoulder that burden. She tried for a faint smile. I needed the work, and I love this place, sir, even if it's flawed right now. There's something about the island, the nature, the quiet, the potential for real paradise. I guess I hoped if I stayed, maybe I could help make it shine again. Donovan felt a tug at his chest. He understood the yearning to fix something broken, to see potential realized. It reminded him of his younger self, the dreamer who believed in building the best hotels in the most remote corners to create getaways unlike any other, before life became a storm of hostile board members or a marriage unraveling piece by piece, before cynicism hardened him. I see, he said quietly. That's admirable. Carmen's cheeks warmed under the glow of the lantern. For a moment, the two just breathed in the hush of the room, each consumed by private thoughts. Then a crackle of static from the walkie-talkie jolted them. Donovan snatched it up. A faint voice came through. Hello? Anyone? Red? Generator? He pressed the button. This is Donovan Cross. I can hear you, but you're breaking up. Who is this? More static, then a slightly clearer signal. Carlos, groundskeeper. The generator's failing. We're trying to keep it going. Storm's too strong. Draining the fuel. I don't know if it'll last more than an hour or two. Donovan looked at Carmen. She leaned forward, concern etched across her face. She recognized the voice. Carlos, she whispered. He pressed the talk button again. Is there anything you need? More fuel? Help? The static roared, and Carlos's faint voice returned. We have limited. The manager never. Enough. If we lose the generator, the emergency systems go down. Then no water pumps, no radio. It's all going to. The line cut out. Donovan tried to hail him again, but only silence met his call. He exchanged a grim look with Carmen. We should go to him, she said, standing abruptly. He's in the maintenance shed by the staff quarters. Donovan frowned. That's halfway across the property, right? The paths are dark and battered by the storm. It's not safe. Carmen's eyebrows knitted. He's alone, and if the generator fails completely, we'll be stuck here without any recourse. No communication, no water supply, nothing. I can't just let him struggle by himself. Donovan hesitated. Every instinct told him not to risk a trek across the island in these extreme conditions. Yet he looked at Carmen. saw the worry in her eyes, and remembered that this entire resort was teetering. If Carlos gave up on the generator, not only would they lose power, they'd lose their only lifeline to outside help. "All right," he said finally, setting the walkie-talkie aside. "We'll go together, but we need to take flashlights, anything that might keep us from losing our way in the dark." She nodded, relief mingling with fear. "I can get the heavy-duty torch from housekeeping. The wind is fierce, so we'll have to stick close." Donovan went to his duffel bag, rummaging for a lightweight rain jacket that he'd barely remembered to pack. He shrugged into it and grabbed a second one. Turning, he offered it to Carmen. "Here, might not be your size, but it'll keep you somewhat dry." Grateful, she accepted, her fingers brushing his as she took the jacket. The contact was fleeting, but he sensed her steady composure behind that gentle exterior. Outside, thunder boomed again, and the candles flickered as if startled. They moved toward the door, pulse rates rising with the threat that lay beyond. The wind howled like a living thing determined to keep them trapped. Even so, Donovan's heart hammered with renewed purpose. He was not about to sit idle while this storm turned from a threat to a disaster. If saving the generator meant risking a trek in the storm, then so be it. He braced his shoulder against the door, pushing it open. Rain blew sideways, instantly wetting his face. Next to him, Carmen hunched into the oversized jacket, raising the heavy-duty torch. They exchanged a final look, courage and concern, and then stepped out into the tempest. A single thought pulsed through Donovan's mind as the wind whipped his hair and water ran into his eyes. No matter the cost, they had to keep this resort afloat. Because somehow, within these battered walls and swirling clouds, he sensed that the path to his own healing might be bound to the fate of this neglected paradise, and to the unwavering spirit of the young woman who walked beside him. Wind-driven rain sliced across Donovan Cross's face as soon as he stepped outside. The bungalow door banged behind him, threatening to tear loose from its hinges in the raging wind. He squinted into the sheets of water, pressing his hood tighter around his head. Beside him, Carmen gripped the heavy-duty flashlight, its beam flickering through the night's stormy gloom. They set off down the short path leading away from Donovan's bungalow. In quieter times, it was probably a picturesque trail lined with lanterns and gentle tropical flora. Tonight, it looked like a nightmare corridor of thrashing palm fronds and muddy puddles. The path lights had all failed when the power went out, leaving only the sporadic glow of lightning overhead and the narrow cone of illumination from Carmen's flashlight. "Careful," she called above the wind. "The ground is uneven here. Watch your step." Donovan braced his shoulders against the gale. "Just keep that light steady." Progress was slow and treacherous. Rain battered them sideways, and each clap of thunder shook the dense air. More than once, Donovan's foot slipped on wet leaves, but he quickly planted himself again, refusing to be toppled. Carmen led him around large palm branches that had snapped free and fallen across the path. Everything smelled of wet earth and sea salt, the storm's ferocity magnifying the island's natural scents into something sharp and urgent. "Which way now?" Donovan shouted when they reached a fork in the path. Carmen raised the flashlight, scanning the signage barely visible under the watery gloom. A broken wooden marker pointed left, labeled Maintenance and Staff Quarters. The arrow looked as if it might have been hammered in years before, with paint flaking away in the strobing lightning. "This way!" she yelled. Her heart thumped in her chest, adrenaline fueling each step. She was more used to carrying fresh linens and cleaning supplies than trudging through tropical storms, but she pressed forward, ignoring her trembling knees. As they continued, the path grew narrower. Palms and thick shrubs crowded in, swaying violently as if reaching for them with ghostly fingers. Donovan felt his pulse pounding in his ears. The entire trip so far had seemed surreal, like some survival test thrown at him by fate. Yet a corner of his mind told him he might actually be relieved to be forced into action. In the office or the boardroom, problems came in the form of spreadsheets and hollow-eyed executives. Here, problems wore the face of torrential rain and fallen tree limbs. Somehow, it felt more honest, more real. Lightning forked across the sky, revealing a clearing ahead. A low building sprawled on the far side, unlit and forlorn. Its metal roof glinted dully in the brief flash. This was presumably the maintenance shed and staff lodging complex. Carmen quickened her pace, raising the flashlight's beam to scan for signs of life. "Carlos!" she shouted. The wind carried her voice away. She tried again, louder. "Carlos!" For a tense moment, the only answer was the roar of rain. Then, faintly, came a muffled clang from the building's far side. Carmen veered off the path, forging her own route through squelching mud, Donovan at her heels. He noticed his boots were already soaked, water sloshing around his ankles with every step. They rounded the corner of the building and spotted an open double door where half the sign read, Maid, CE. The rest had broken off. Inside, flickering candlelight revealed the silhouettes of tool racks, battered machinery, and a large generator set up in the center of the space. A figure hunched over it, muscles taut as he tried to tighten some valve or connection. As lightning pulsed overhead, Donovan and Carmen recognized Carlos, the groundskeeper, wearing a drenched tank top and cargo pants flecked with mud. "Carlos!" Carmen cried again, stepping inside. The wind abated a little once they were under the corrugated roof, though rain still sprayed in from the open doors. "We heard you on the walkie. Are you all right?" Carlos lifted his head, relief crossing his rough-hewn features. "You came. Thank goodness. It's about to blow." He jerked his chin at the generator. "I've done everything I can, but the fuel lines are nearly empty. The manager was supposed to order more supplies last month and never did." Donovan felt a surge of anger as he approached. Water ran down his hood, dripping onto the concrete floor. "So we're nearly out of fuel altogether?" Carlos nodded bitterly. "I've got maybe an hour's worth left, if that. The storm is so intense that the system's draining more quickly. Once it's gone, we lose what little emergency power we have. Radios, water pumps, the works." He moved aside to show them the fuel gauge. The needle hovered dangerously close to empty. Carmen set the flashlight on a nearby crate, propping it so the beam illuminated the generator. Her chest heaved from the run in the storm. "Is there any backup supply at all? Something we missed?" "Maybe a small reserve," Carlos said, gesturing to a locked storage cabinet. "But it's nowhere near enough to get us through the night." Donovan swept his gaze across the cluttered maintenance shed. Tools and hoses lay scattered around, some rusting from neglect. A few old barrels were shoved against one wall. "What about those?" he asked, pointing at the barrels. "Water, mostly," Carlos explained, "and a few leftover chemicals for cleaning the pool filters." He gave a hollow laugh. "We never got around to draining them properly." A flash of lightning stung their eyes, followed by a thunderous crack that rattled the entire structure. The overhead lamp swung precariously, threatening to topple. For a second, Donovan's mind whirled. He was used to solving problems with phone calls and big checks. But here, money was worthless if they didn't have physical resources to survive. Fuel wasn't something he could conjure from thin air. Carmen's brow furrowed as she stared at the generator. "If we can't keep it running, we lose everything. Is there any boat we can reach? Another supply on the far side of the island?" Carlos shook his head grimly. The resort's primary boat got sent for repair months ago, and the manager took the smaller one to the mainland. He said he'd be back, but that was days ago. With this storm, there's no way a supply plane or boat will come near us. "And no one else from the staff can help?" Donovan asked, gripping his rain jacket's collar. "Anyone who might have a secret stash of gas?" Carlos gave him a helpless shrug. "We're the only ones left working tonight. The family that handles the kitchen is just trying to keep their kids safe in the staff lodging. There's no secret fuel hidden anywhere that I know of. The manager was supposed to order a new shipment last week. He never did." Silence fell. Outside, the wind roared, and the rain hammered the metal roof like an unrelenting drum. Candlelight guttered, nearly extinguished by the draft. The generator hummed ominously, each fluctuation in its pitch hinting that it wouldn't last. Donovan exhaled slowly, forcing his mind into a problem-solving mode. All right, so we have maybe an hour. After that, the entire property goes dark. Let's assume that's inevitable. What's our best move to protect ourselves and any other guests? We can't just wait for rescue if the comms die. Carmen studied him, surprised by the steady authority in his tone. In the office, Donovan had once been known for his crisis management. She was seeing a glimpse of that skill now. We have a shortwave radio in the main reception area, she said. It's older, but it might still work on minimal power. We could try to send out a distress call while the generator is running. Carlos perked up. That's a good idea. I tried the normal radio in the staff lounge, but it's too weak. The shortwave at reception might have enough range to reach the mainland, or at least a passing ship. Donovan nodded. Let's do that. Carmen, you and I can head to reception, see if we can power that radio quickly. Carlos, keep an eye on the generator, just enough to let us get a signal out. But it might fail any minute, Carlos warned. The fuel line is done for. Then we move fast, Donovan replied, voice firm. And if it fails completely, we regroup. We'll bring as many candles and supplies as we can to a central location. The guests can gather in a place that's safer than those separate bungalows if it comes to that. Carmen squeezed her hands together, adrenaline making her skin tingle. This was a new side of Donovan, a man determined not just to weather the storm, but to fight for the safety of every soul on the island. All right, she said. Let's hurry. She plucked up the flashlight, and Donovan grabbed another smaller torch from a workbench. Together, they sloshed back outside into the torrents of rain. Carlos followed to the doorway, pointing out a narrower path that led directly toward the resort's central offices. Thunder roared again, and the sky ignited with electric arcs. Donovan and Carmen started to run, feet pounding the muddy ground. His instincts told him that the radio was their last fragile link to the outside world. They had to make contact, or else endure this entire storm cut off from any chance of rescue. Every stride hammered Donovan's knees, but he kept going, water streaming down his face. Carmen gritted her teeth, pressing forward with the beam of the flashlight cutting through the swirling darkness. Palm trees bent at agonized angles, and debris cluttered the pathways. Fallen leaves, broken branches, scraps of thatch from roof shingles. More than once they had to pause to clamber over a chunk of a toppled coconut palm. Neither spoke much. The roar of the wind made conversation nearly impossible. But there was a unity in their movements, as if they'd been partners for longer than these few hours. Shoulder to shoulder, they navigated the storm-lashed labyrinth, each scanning for hazards, pointing them out with quick gestures. Carmen watched Donovan from the corner of her eye. This man who had arrived as a stern-faced, high-profile guest, now soaked and muddy, determined to save everyone trapped on his battered resort. Lightning illuminated the shape of the main reception building ahead. Like all structures here, it was styled in a tropical luxury design, but everything about it now appeared battered and forlorn. Water dripped off the thatched roof, and the front windows were black. Even the sign that read, "Welcome to Paradise Bay Resort," was half torn, flapping in the wind with a mournful squeak. They scrambled under the overhang, Carmen shoving the door open. Donovan stumbled in behind her, flicking on his smaller torch. The lobby stretched out as a silhouette of lounge chairs and a modest front desk. Once upon a time, it might have been a place of polished floors and breezy elegance for visiting VIPs. Now it looked more like a cavern of shadows, with water pooling in the corners where the roof leaked. Carmen wasted no time. "This way," she said, making for a small side office behind the front desk. Donovan followed, shining his flashlight over the walls. Faded brochures littered a table, touting pristine beaches and restful spa experiences. a bleak contrast to the chaos outside. She found the shortwave radio set up on a wooden desk covered in disorganized papers and a few half-filled coffee cups. Something told Donovan that housekeeping never had the bandwidth to tidy this space. Carmen quickly checked the cords. "We need power," she said anxiously, "even if we can only get a trickle." Donovan flipped a switch near the desk. Static crackled from the radio's speaker. Both of them froze, exchanging a look of cautious hope. "It's still running," he whispered. "So the generator hasn't died yet." Carmen pressed the transmit button. "Hello? This is Paradise Bay Resort calling. Please, we need immediate assistance. If anyone is receiving, please respond." She waited, eyes darting to Donovan. Silence. Then a hiss of static. She tried another frequency. For several agonizing moments, all they heard was the persistent crackle of interference. Donovan's gut twisted. If no one was listening, if the storm blocked the signal, they'd be truly isolated. He took a breath, leaning toward the microphone. "This is Donovan Cross, requesting emergency support. We have limited staff, 4 or 5 guests on the island, no functional transport. Weather severe. Can anyone hear us?" Static again. A faint pop. Carmen dared not look at him. She feared seeing the same dread that churned inside her. Thunder boomed overhead, so close it seemed to shake the foundation. Donovan tried the next channel, calling out the same plea, frustration building with each unanswered second. Then, out of nowhere, a distant voice crackled, barely audible. "Opie, Bay Resort, storms, repeat." The words dissolved in static. Carmen's eyes widened. She adjusted the frequency dial, carefully fine-tuning. Donovan repeated their message, heart pounding. Finally, a partial response broke through. "We read you. Severe storm. Approaches. Evacuation. Not possible. Hold position. Will attempt rescue after conditions. Better." Carmen slumped, relief and worry mingling. At least someone heard them. But the message was clear. No immediate rescue. Donovan pressed the button again. "We understand. Please send help as soon as conditions allow. We have limited resources. Possibly losing generators soon. Over." The reply was garbled, but they caught the gist. "Understood. Keep safe. We'll contact. Hang tight." And then the channel sputtered into white noise. Carmen let out a shaky breath, glancing at Donovan. They had managed to get word out, but the cavalry wasn't coming tonight. Maybe not even tomorrow. "At least they know we're here," she said, attempting a hopeful tone. Donovan nodded, setting the radio's microphone down gently. "We should let the others know we've made contact, and figure out a plan to centralize everyone if the storm intensifies." He looked around the cramped office, mind already leaping to the next challenge. The shortwave had done its job, but the generator might fail any moment, cutting them off again. They needed a secure place to gather, enough supplies to outlast the storm, and a system to maintain some form of communication. He felt that old surge of clarity, like facing a crucial board meeting, but multiplied tenfold in urgency. Carmen watched him. "Where do we bring them? The main lobby? One of the bigger common rooms?" He rubbed his jaw, scanning the dark corners of the space. "We need somewhere structurally sound, away from windows or potential flooding. Maybe the staff lounge in the basement of this building, if it's not compromised by water, or the big storage hall near the dining area." She thought a moment, recalling the layout. The staff lounge is partially underground. Might be the safest spot from high winds. We'll check if it's flooded. "Right," Donovan said, exhaling. "Let's head there. But first we should confirm the generator's status. If it fails while we're trying to relocate everyone, we'll need every candle and flashlight we can muster." Carmen nodded. "I'll radio Carlos to see if he can keep it alive a little longer." She reached for the shortwave mic, but only static responded. "We might need to go back in person," she concluded, her eyes flicking to Donovan. Again that fierce wind howled, reminding them of the precarious situation outside. yet a sense of unity pulsed between them. Donovan Cross might be the CEO who had once overlooked details of this island paradise, but now he stood shoulder to shoulder with Carmen Alvarez, a maid who believed in its hidden potential. Together, they were two people who refused to let a savage storm tear down what could still be saved. "Then let's go," Donovan said, shining his flashlight toward the door. "We'll coordinate the move, gather the guests, and ride this storm out, no matter how rough it gets." A distant crash of thunder served as both punctuation and warning. The next hours would test not just their resourcefulness, but also the fragile bond developing between them. Outside, the storm raged on, as though determined to challenge their every resolve. And in the flicker of the radio's final static, Donovan and Carmen braced themselves for the fight of their lives. Lightning split the sky in a jagged silvery fork as Donovan Cross and Carmen Alvarez stepped out of the reception building. Immediately, the fury of the storm struck them anew, wind whipping so violently it felt as though the air itself had weight. Rain slashed against their faces, forcing them to half-close their eyes. They had managed to send out a distress call, but rescue was at the mercy of the storm's retreat, which seemed nowhere in sight. "Stick close!" Donovan shouted over the roar. He gripped the flashlight tightly, angling it to cut through the swirling night. Carmen gave a nod of acknowledgement, raising her own smaller torch. Her soaked uniform was plastered to her skin, and Donovan's jacket was losing its battle against the deluge. Still, they trudged onward, forging a plan with each determined step. At the far end of the building, a side path led downward into the basement level, once designed for staff lounges and storage. This was where Carmen suspected they could gather everyone. Donovan eyed the half-flooded walkway warily. Water gushed down the concrete steps, forming frothing puddles. The overhead gutter had long since overflowed, pouring sheets of rain across their path like an unrelenting waterfall. "Careful!" Carmen called, but the warning came too late. Donovan stepped down onto the slick second step, and his footing vanished. He pitched forward. Before he could fall headlong, Carmen dropped her flashlight and grabbed his arm. The jolt of her grip steadied him, and for a breathless instant, they clung to each other. Adrenaline shot through Donovan's veins as he realized how narrowly he'd avoided a harsh tumble. "Thank you," he gasped, regaining his balance. He felt Carmen's hands linger on his arm, her fingers trembling from more than just the cold. Her cheeks were flushed in the pale glow of the fallen flashlight. "Be careful," she repeated, her voice softer now. For an instant, the frantic storm around them seemed to recede, leaving only the two of them in a fragile space of mutual concern. Then thunder crashed overhead, snapping them back to reality. Carmen cleared her throat. "I'll lead." She stepped forward, testing each foothold, guiding them down into the basement level. Water gushed around their ankles, but they managed to reach the lower landing in one piece. Donovan crouched to retrieve Carmen's flashlight, shining it across a battered metal door with a small window. The words "Staff Lounge" had been stenciled there, though time and weather had faded them nearly to invisibility. Carmen tried the door. It stuck, jammed from either swollen wood or debris. She pressed her shoulder against it, gritting her teeth, and Donovan joined in. Together, with a heave, they forced it open. A rush of musty air greeted them, along with the distinct tang of dampness. The overhead fluorescent lights were, of course, dark. No power remained for that corner of the property. Donovan swept the flashlight around. The room beyond was a broad lounge area with couches, chairs, and a small kitchenette at the far side. The floor was slick but not fully flooded, suggesting the water had seeped in only recently. He spotted a sagging ceiling tile in one corner, dripping steadily into a growing puddle. Carmen let out a breath. "We can try to reinforce the door with towels, maybe block some water from coming in, but it'll never be perfect." Donovan nodded. "Agreed. First, let's see if there's any sign of other staff." His voice echoed slightly in the cavernous gloom. "Carlos might have guided them here, or—" A sudden burst of static interrupted him. Carmen fumbled for the walkie-talkie at her belt. "Carlos?" she said, pressing the side button. "Are you there?" His voice crackled through amidst heavy static. "Minute. Generator. Final warnings. Get the guests to safety." The walkie-talkie sputtered, then went silent. Carmen cursed under her breath, her frustration at the failing equipment clear. Donovan exhaled slowly. "We have to assume time is almost up. The power will go any second." She swallowed, scanning the lounge. "We should gather blankets, towels, anything to keep people warm and comfortable. Maybe the kitchenette still has supplies. If we have to bunker down here, we'll need to keep spirits up." Donovan flicked his flashlight to a hallway branching off the lounge. "I'll check that side. You look here. We'll meet back in a few minutes." She nodded, her face set with resolve. As Donovan strode away, his footsteps echoed against the tile. Each flash of lightning from the narrow basement windows reminded him that nature was still raging, unstoppable and indifferent to their plight. He peered into the first side room, a storage closet crammed with old uniforms, spare linens, and cleaning supplies. Some of the boxes were damp, but he found 2 large bins of unopened towels and several folded blankets. Quickly, he stacked them near the door. Next, he poked into what looked like a break room lined with gray metal lockers. No staff, just silence and the distant pounding of rain outside. When he returned to the lounge, Carmen was rummaging through the kitchenette cabinets. She'd already spread out some towels around the base of the door to slow the inflow of water. Her sodden hair clung to the sides of her face, but her movements were efficient and determined. "I found a stash of bottled water," she called, holding up a 6-pack. "Some instant coffee, cereal bars, basic stuff. Better than nothing." Donovan set his bundle of blankets and towels on a large central table. "That's good. Let's keep searching. If we can gather enough supplies to last a day or two, we'll be in better shape." A low creak rumbled through the building then, the sound of the storm testing every joint of its structure. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Carmen's gaze darted upward, worry etched in her eyes. "We need to be sure it's safe to gather everyone here. The building itself, do you think it can withstand this wind?" Donovan approached, hesitating as he studied her. Water from her hair dripped onto the floor. She looked exhausted. So did he imagined. Yet a hidden strength pulsed in her. She reminded him of a young upstart employee he might have once admired, except she was more. She was caring, resourceful, and unafraid to voice her thoughts. Something about that stirred a strange warmth in his chest, even in the midst of crisis. "It's solid concrete for the lower level," he offered, "though the roofing might be questionable. If we can keep water out, it should hold up better than the bungalows. Let's bring everyone down soon." She nodded firmly. "All right, we'll do that. But first we check on the family and the honeymooners." Donovan couldn't hide his concern. "Do you know where they are?" Carmen set the water bottles on a countertop. "The honeymooners are in Bungalow 6, near the west shore. The family, husband, wife, and their little boy, were in Bungalow 10, on the eastern ridge. I told them to shelter in place, but that was before we knew how bad this would be." He grimaced. Bungalow 10 was perched on slightly higher ground, which might be safer from flooding, but it would also be more exposed to savage winds. "We'll split up and get them, then lead them here." "I should go to Bungalow 10, Carmen said, matter of fact. "I know the path better, plus the boy usually recognizes me. He might be scared by all this thunder. If you could head to Bungalow 6. Donovan's instinct was to protest. He hated letting her trek off alone. But the logic was sound. They needed to hurry. "All right," he conceded. "But we set a time limit. If you aren't back here in, say, 20 minutes, I'll come searching for you." She mustered a ghost of a smile. "Deal. You do the same." They gathered supplies, flashlights, more towels, and a few of the blankets. Carmen slung a tote bag of cereal bars and bottles over her shoulder. Thunder shook the basement again, a constant reminder of nature's power. Donovan paused, resting a hand lightly on her arm. Their eyes met in the dim glow. "Be safe," he murmured. There was more he wanted to say. Some reassurance that they'd make it through, that he wouldn't let her shoulder this alone. But the words stayed trapped behind his breath. She nodded, her gaze flickering with something like gratitude before she steeled herself. "You too. Don't do anything reckless." He managed a wry half-smile, dropping his hand. Then they parted ways, Carmen heading out the door first, back up the flooded stairs. Donovan lingered a moment, hearing her footsteps splash away, then forced himself to turn in the opposite direction. He had to push aside the faint sense of dread that parted them. There was work to be done. Outside, the storm howled like a living beast. The swirling wind tore at Donovan's makeshift hood as he left the basement's meager shelter. Rain stung his eyes, forcing him to keep his head low. Lightning rippled across the sky, revealing twisted palm trees and scattered debris. He took the route that wound west toward Bungalow 6, each step a fight against wind and water. His mind spun with half-formed hopes that the honeymooners were unharmed, that Carmen would gather the family safely, that none of the structures would collapse in this onslaught. Yet beneath it all, an unexpected surge of determination steadied him. This island, battered and neglected, needed someone willing to care. And Carmen, an employee with a spine of steel, had shown him how important that was. He wasn't just saving a few guests. He was saving a vision of what he once wanted his resorts to represent: comfort and sanctuary, even in the most remote places. He pushed on into the night, thunder shaking the sky overhead. Bungalow lights had all died. No flicker of life beckoned. Still, he knew that the honeymoon couple was probably inside, scared and confused, in dire need of reassurance. As Donovan navigated a fallen coconut tree blocking part of the walkway, he braced his shoulders, ignoring the water streaming down his face. In that instant, he decided he'd see this through, no matter what. If he could guide them all to safety, perhaps he'd find atonement for the neglect that brought this resort, and his life, to a tipping point. And he prayed silently that Carmen would be all right too, out there in the storm, risking herself for the family in Bungalow 10. For now, they both battled the elements alone, spurred on by the same unspoken conviction. Though each remained separated by the raging darkness, a single spark of faith united them, that by caring for others, they might just find the strength to save themselves. Between the flashes of lightning, the path to Bungalow 6 vanished under coils of wind-driven rain. Donovan braced a palm against a swaying palm trunk to steady himself, inhaling air that tasted of salt and damp leaves. For a moment, the next footstep seemed impossible. Every sense was overwhelmed by the storm's relentless fury. Then lightning flared again, and he glimpsed the faint outline of a bungalow's pitched roof ahead. Renewed by that sight, he pressed on. His heart pounded with each slogging step over the flooded walkway. Torn fronds and fallen branches cluttered the path, turning the simple trek into an obstacle course. Donovan nearly tripped over a dislodged paver stone, cursing under his breath at how quickly this paradise had transformed into a war zone. In the corner of his mind, he couldn't help thinking of Carmen, trekking alone in another direction to save a terrified family. The idea that she might be in danger spurred him forward even faster. At last, he reached a low wooden sign that read, "Bungalow 6, in elegant script. The placard was half torn from its post, clattering in the wind. The bungalow itself was dark, not a single light to be seen. Donovan approached the front steps, calling out over the thunder, "Hello, is anyone in there?" No immediate answer, only the howl of the storm. He banged on the door. "It's Donovan Cross. I'm here to help." Still no reply. His chest tightened. Was he too late? Were they still inside? He reached for the doorknob. Locked. Another peal of thunder rattled overhead. Donovan pounded again, this time more forcefully. After a nerve-wracking pause, he thought he heard something, a muffled shout. It was enough. He angled his flashlight at the lock, searching for a way in. Suddenly, the door creaked open by just a crack. A pale face peeked out, tousled hair, wide eyes, a woman in her 20s. She looked terrified. "Who?" "It's okay," Donovan said, raising his voice over the wind. "I'm with the resort. We have to get you someplace safer. The storm is too strong to stay here." Her eyes flicked to his flashlight and soaked rain jacket. My husband, he's in here. We heard the wind, the thunder, the windows started leaking. We didn't know what to do." "Let me in," he urged. "I can explain." She hesitated only a second before pulling the door wide enough for him to slip through. Inside, the bungalow was eerily quiet compared to the roar outside, though water dripped from multiple leaks in the thatched roof, creating a discordant tap-tap on the floor. He spotted the woman's husband near a low couch, frantically shoving towels against the threshold of a glass door that led to a small balcony. Puddles spread across the floor, evidence that the wind and rain had forced their way in. Donovan introduced himself quickly, wiping rainwater from his brow. "I'm Donovan. The power's out, but we still have an emergency plan. You can't stay here. It's too exposed. We've got a gathering point in the basement of the main building. That's our best chance." The husband turned, looking simultaneously relieved and anxious. "We were trying to hold out, but we can't stop the water. And the wind—" Another gust slammed the bungalow, making the wooden walls groan. The couple exchanged a fearful glance. "We'll lead you to safety," Donovan assured them. "Grab your essentials. Warm clothes, maybe a blanket if you can. Hurry." It took only moments for them to scramble around the darkened space, collecting a small bag that presumably held passports, phones, and some personal items. Donovan asked if either of them was injured. They shook their heads, though the wife confessed that her heart was pounding out of her chest. "I'm Karen, by the way," she said, voice trembling but trying to be polite. "And this is Noah." Noah gave a brief nod, zipping the bag closed. "We weren't sure if anyone from the resort was still here. We felt so abandoned." Donovan pressed his lips together. "I'm sorry. The manager is missing and staff is limited, but we're still fighting to keep everyone safe. Let's go." He shone his flashlight back at the door. "Stay close to me. It's going to be rough outside." They stepped into the raging wind. Rain whipped their faces, and Karen let out a yelp when she nearly slipped on a soaked board. Donovan caught her arm, steadying her, while Noah guided from her other side. Slowly, they maneuvered down the short path that connected Bungalow 6 to the main walkway. "Where are we going?" Noah shouted. "The basement lounge," Donovan hollered in return. "We have supplies there, if we can keep it from flooding too badly." Lightning flared, illuminating fallen palm trees and deep puddles swirling with leaves. The entire island felt like it was under siege from an enraged sea and sky. Donovan's mind flicked to Carmen. Was she safe at Bungalow 10? Had she found the family? He led the honeymooners across a narrow wooden footbridge that spanned a small decorative pond. The water level had risen, overtopping the banks. The footbridge itself groaned under the onslaught of wind. Halfway across, a deafening crack rent the air. A large palm on the far side started to topple. "Run!" Donovan barked, pushing Karen and Noah forward. They sprinted the last few steps, half sliding on wet planks. The palm crashed behind them with a teeth-rattling thud, sending droplets and splintered wood flying. If they'd been even a second slower, the trunk would have pinned them. Panting, Donovan regrouped with the couple. "We can't go back that way," he said grimly, pointing to the fallen palm blocking the bridge. "The main path to the lounge is on the other side of the property. We'll have to navigate around." Fear sparked in Karen's eyes. "But we don't know any other way." Donovan forced a reassuring tone. "I've studied the resort's map. We can cut through the courtyard near the spa building. It's a bit longer, but it leads to the same place." Noah gave a shaky nod, gripping his wife's hand. Donovan took the lead once more, forging a new route across the grounds. Every few steps, they had to duck under drooping power lines or skirt around uprooted bushes. The courtyard, once a manicured haven of tropical flowers and koi ponds, lay in shambles. water everywhere, cracked pathways, shredded greenery. Still, the three pressed on. Donovan's thoughts churned with guilt for letting the resort's maintenance spiral so far out of control. This place was supposed to be a gem, an escape from stress, not a death trap in a storm. At last, they reached the faint glow of a flickering lantern up ahead. Someone had placed it outside the staff lounge entrance. Donovan felt a surge of relief. That meant either Carmen or someone else was already there. He guided the couple into the half-submerged stairwell leading down. Water trickled around the steps, but it was less intense than earlier. They pushed the door open, stumbling inside. In the lounge's dimness, they found two staff members from the kitchen, the mother and father, plus their small daughter huddled under blankets. Clearly, they'd decided to make the basement their haven, too. A battered lantern cast weak light across the space, revealing the worried faces turned their way.
"Donovan!"
the mother cried, relief plain in her voice.
"Have you seen Carmen? She told us to meet here and we've been waiting."
Donovan's pulse kicked up a notch. "Not yet. I left her heading for Bungalow 10 to retrieve another family." He exhaled, wiping rain from his brow. "We'll give her a bit more time, then—" Suddenly, the entire building shuddered. A deep groan reverberated through the walls and the generator's faint hum sputtered, then died altogether. In an instant, the overhead flicker of emergency lighting, so faintly glowing before, blinked out. Utter darkness swallowed them. No one moved for a moment, the hush broken only by the nervous whimper of the little girl and the pounding rain overhead. Donovan clicked his flashlight on, scanning the room. The lantern glowed feebly, threatening to gutter. They'd known the generator was running on borrowed time, but the finality of losing it still slammed Donovan with a rush of dread. No radio, no pumps, no last vestige of power. Their fragile link to the outside world was gone, at least for now. Karen and Noah clung to each other, panting from their frantic run. The kitchen staff couple comforted their daughter, who sobbed softly. Donovan steeled himself, focusing on the immediate need. Carmen and the family from Bungalow 10 were still out there. He turned to the staff father, a gaunt man with worry lines etched deep into his face. "You said Carmen told you to come here? Did she say anything else?" The man shook his head. "Only that she'd bring the folks from Bungalow 10 and meet us soon. That was maybe 10 minutes ago." Donovan's gaze flicked to his watch. He could barely make out the time in the dim light. He'd told Carmen they'd regroup in 20 minutes. How long had it been? 15? 18? The swirl of chaos made it hard to measure. Regardless, she was cutting it close. The building groaned again, and the overhead rum of wind made the entire lounge feel like a submarine under siege. Donovan forced himself to speak calmly. "All right, let's arrange these blankets. We'll form a space that's as dry as possible in the corner, away from the leaking spots. Noah, can you help me fortify the door to keep more water out?" Noah nodded, already stepping forward. The others launched into quiet activity, needing a sense of purpose to stave off fear. Donovan spared a thought to Carmen with each breath, praying she was safe. She was resourceful, he reminded himself. She'd been the one guiding him since day one. Yet the pounding storm offered no mercy. Every thunderclap resonated with foreboding. The minutes ticked by. Donovan found himself pacing the waterlogged floor, watching the door as if expecting Carmen to burst in at any second. Each time lightning flared through the narrow windows, he craned his neck, hoping to see movement outside in the swirling dark. But she did not appear. The swirling question in Donovan's mind grew louder. What if something happened to her? He pictured collapsed trees, rising floodwaters, the possibility of a mishap on the slippery paths. Guilt threatened to choke him. He'd let her go alone. He should have insisted they stay together. Or he should have gone himself. He forced himself to think, if she's not back soon, I'll go out to find her. That resolve tightened in his chest. He and Carmen had risked their own safety to save these guests. Now that they were here, he could not, would not, leave her to fend for herself. Lightning flashed once more, illuminating the lounge in a momentary blaze of white. Then darkness returned, and Donovan inhaled the damp, stale air. Whatever it took, he would not abandon Carmen Alvarez in this storm. If their bond had begun as mere caretaker and guest, or boss and employee, it had grown into something deeper, a partnership forged in crisis. The wind outside keened, fierce and unrelenting. Time was running out. If Carmen didn't return soon, Donovan knew exactly what he had to do. Brave the storm one more time, search every path, every flooded corner of the island, until he brought her back. Because in that flash of clarity, he understood a truth that stunned him. Losing her was not an option. He pressed his palm against the cool wall, gazing at the door with tense determination. Above the crash of thunder, his mind echoed with a vow, "Carmen, please hold on, I'm coming for you." A roar of wind slammed against the basement lounge door, rattling it in its frame. Donovan Cross froze mid-step, every nerve on edge, hoping that this sudden commotion signaled Carmen's return. But the door did not budge. No quick knock or familiar voice reached his ears, only the relentless shriek of the storm pressing its weight against the battered structure. Outside, lightning cracked in quick succession, as if the heavens themselves were pounding a war drum. He turned to the small group clustered in the dimly lit lounge. Karen and Noah, the newlywed couple, the young kitchen staff family with their wide-eyed child. Their expressions were a tangle of exhaustion and fear, each fighting to remain calm despite the uncertainty. Water seeped in from multiple points, beneath the door, along the edges of a window near the ceiling. Donovan's flashlight shone on a growing puddle that darkened the lounge's old linoleum. Every few moments, a thunderclap reverberated, so strong it felt like the ground trembled. Carmen still hadn't arrived. Donovan clenched his fists, his mind racing with questions. How much time had elapsed since they parted? It felt like an eternity, though realistically it might have been only 15 or 20 minutes. He'd promised to wait a short while before going after her, but dread churned in his gut. If something had happened, if a fallen tree blocked her route, or if swirling floodwater had trapped her and the family from Bungalow 10, then every second that passed might spell disaster. He inhaled, seeking composure, and stepped over to the cluster of worried faces. In the fading glow of a single lantern perched on a table, he tried to speak with authority. "I'm going out to find Carmen and the other family," he said firmly, voice low enough not to alarm the child. "She should have been back by now." Karen shook her head, eyes going wide. "But you can't. It's crazy out there. That palm tree almost crushed us on the way here." Noah nodded in agreement, pressing a protective hand to Karen's shoulder. "We barely made it ourselves. If you go, you risk getting lost or hurt. Then who will help if something goes wrong here? I can't just stay put." Donovan's voice tightened with conviction. He could see the logic in their warning. If he went out, he might not return. But the alternative felt unthinkable. "Carmen would do the same for any of us. She's risking her life to bring that family to safety. I won't abandon them." The mother from the kitchen staff raised a hesitant voice. "We're grateful you came for us, but maybe Carmen found another route. She's resourceful. Isn't it best to wait a little more? The storm might calm." Donovan shook his head. "Judging by the intensity, this storm isn't showing any sign of stopping soon. If she's trapped somewhere, waiting longer only decreases our odds of helping. The basement might be safe enough for now, certainly safer than wandering the island. But that's exactly why I have to do it, so someone else doesn't have to." He glanced at the child who was curled up beneath a blanket, eyes full of tears. Donovan softened his tone. "Look, all of you stay here. Block the door if the wind worsens. Conserve your lantern's fuel. I'll do my best to return with Carmen and the other guests as fast as I can." Before anyone could offer further protest, Donovan knelt by his bundled collection of blankets and rummaged for a spare flashlight, one of the last spares they had. He tucked it under his belt, then stood, casting a final look over the group. He saw desperation in their eyes, saw how they looked to him for direction. Before this crisis, he'd felt undone by his divorce and the meltdown of his personal life. Now, ironically, he was needed more than ever. "You're sure about this?" Noah asked, stepping up. The man's voice held equal parts gratitude and alarm. "At least let me come with you." Donovan briefly considered it. Another set of hands might be helpful, but it also doubled the risk that someone could be lost or injured. He weighed the honeymooners' inexperience with the island, the severity of the storm, and the fact that the group in the lounge needed adult help if a partial collapse or flood occurred. He shook his head, firm. "Stay here, protect your wife, and watch over these folks. One less person to worry about in the storm means I can move faster." Noah looked poised to argue but relented under Donovan's stern gaze. Instead, he reached out and offered a handshake. Donovan took it, their grip strong, a silent exchange of respect. Then, with a steadying breath, Donovan approached the lounge door. The wind howled outside, scraping the door with a rasping sound. Each rumble of thunder made his heart pound. He thought of Carmen's dark eyes, the determination in her face, and the warmth in her voice when she said she'd bring that family to safety. He had to find her. He pulled the door open. Wind and rain immediately tore at the edges of the blanket barricade. With a grunt, he forced his way out, shutting the door behind him. The howling tempest closed around him like a hungry mouth. Everything beyond the small patch of doorstep was awash in blackness, broken only by jagged lightning. Water gushed from the overhead gutters, splashing off his hood in near-constant streams. "All right, Donovan," he muttered to himself, adrenaline coursing. "Focus." His memory of the island's layout told him that Bungalow 10 sat on higher ground along a ridge toward the eastern edge. That meant he needed to circle the main building, navigate the open courtyards, and then climb the walkway that wound around the ridge. Even under normal conditions, it was a bit of a trek. In this chaos, it might be near impossible. He pressed forward, staggering under gusts that nearly knocked him to his knees. The wind seemed to shift unpredictably, one moment shoving him sideways, the next nearly ripping him backward. Around him, the island moaned. Bent palm trees rattled, the shrieks of their fronds reminiscent of frightened animals. Donut-shaped lawn chairs, once artfully arranged around a pool, now lay strewn in random piles. Sand and salt stung his face whenever the wind took a certain angle. Lightning flared overhead, and for half a second, the entire resort flickered in silhouette. Donovan glimpsed shattered windows, upturned carts, waves surging far too close to the usual shoreline. In that frozen instant of brilliance, he saw a path that curved around what used to be the pool area. If he could get across that stretch of pavement, now littered with debris, he might slip behind the row of staff cabins and catch the route up the ridge. He made for it, each step a battle. The pool itself had overflowed, turning the surrounding area into a lake of brackish water. He waded in cautiously, cursing as water sloshed up to his calves. The wind whipped up small waves against his legs, and he had to fight for balance. Overhead, thunder boomed again, but he pushed forward, shining his flashlight. The beam bounced off the rippling water, revealing a slick walkway on the far side. He nearly cried out in relief when he reached solid ground again, though a fallen tree trunk blocked the immediate path. Donovan clambered over it, ignoring the scrape of splintered bark against his rain jacket. Once he cleared it, he could see the slope that led upward toward the eastern ridge. The path was narrower than usual, half hidden by tangles of broken foliage. No turning back. He started up the incline, bending low in the face of lashing gusts. Each footstep squished in the muddy ground. Occasionally he paused to shine the flashlight ahead, ensuring he didn't plummet into a sudden washout or trip on a fallen trunk. The climb seemed interminable. Lightning gave him glimpses of the path's twisted route. At times, thunder rolled so forcefully that he could feel it vibrating in his ribcage. A snagging branch hooked onto his jacket, halting his forward momentum. Donovan cursed, twisting free. His breath came in ragged gasps, the air thick with humidity and dread. If Carmen made it this way, how did she manage? She must have been forced to find alternate routes, or perhaps even use the staff side trails. The undergrowth was thick, more than enough to hide an entire family if they were stuck. He stopped, tried to think rationally. "Carmen!" he called into the night. The wind tore the word from his lips, scattering it before it could go far. He attempted again, louder, but the storm devoured his shout. Another flash of lightning revealed a shape in the distance. Was that a figure, or just a leaning palm? He squinted, but the darkness returned, and the afterimage left him uncertain. Continuing forward, he reached a bend where the path overlooked a sharp drop. Rain pelted him so fiercely that he nearly lost the flashlight from his grip. At that moment, the wind carried a sound, faint yet distinct, a cry or shout carried from some unknown point on the ridge. Donovan's heart jumped. He angled his body, trying to catch the direction of that noise. Another low moan of wind twisted through the trees, but no second shout followed. Was it Carmen, the family's child, or just his imagination? Raising the flashlight, he pressed on, calling out every few steps. "Carmen, can you hear me?" Lightning painted the night again. This time he thought he saw a subtle movement near a small structure, a maintenance hut perched on the ridge. Perhaps the manager used it for storing gardening equipment. Could that be where Carmen had taken shelter? He wrestled past a row of toppled shrubs. Mud caked his boots, each footstep squelching as if the ground wanted to swallow him. When he finally reached the structure, he found the door ajar, banging in the wind. He braced himself against the frame. "Hello?" he hollered, shining the flashlight inside. Empty, just a bunch of half-rusted tools, battered sacks of fertilizer, and a stale smell. No sign of Carmen or the family. Donovan's pulse hammered with renewed anxiety. Time was slipping away. He was soaked to the bone, shivering from a combination of cold and raw adrenaline. Come on," he muttered, forcing himself back outside. The ridge path continued onward, curving behind the maintenance hut. Maybe the family had tried to follow a more direct route, or maybe Carmen had found them and guided them somewhere to wait out the storm. The question was, where? He resumed his slow climb. A bizarre hush descended between bursts of thunder, and in that fleeting lull he heard something new, a child's voice, shrill with fear. Donovan's pulse spiked as he scrambled around the next bend. "Carmen!" he shouted again, his voice cracking. Lightning tore across the sky, and this time there was no mistaking it. A small figure huddled on the ground near the path. Donovan saw the glint of water on a child's face, eyes wide, hair soaked. Instantly he lurched forward, nearly slipping in the mud. The child let out a sobbing gasp as Donovan approached. Then, over the thunder, came another voice, faint but desperate. "Hang on! I'm here!" Carmen's voice. A swell of relief nearly buckled Donovan's knees. He aimed the flashlight beyond the child and found Carmen kneeling a short distance away, trying to lift a man from a shallow ravine. The woman from Bungalow 10 was half-crouched beside her, arms wrapped around another child. It looked like the father had slipped down the muddy slope and wrenched his ankle, or worse. "Donovan!" Carmen cried when the flashlight beam fell on him. Her voice trembled with exertion. "We're stuck! He can't walk! He slipped! I couldn't leave them, but I can't pull him up alone!" Donovan wasted no time. He sloshed closer, taking in the scene. The father's leg was twisted and his face gleamed with pain. The mother clutched their young boy, tears streaking her cheeks. They looked battered by wind and fear. And Carmen, though exhausted and soaked, was still fighting, arms braced as she tried to shift the injured man upright. Donovan plunged a hand under the man's arm, hooking his other around a sturdy branch for leverage. Mud threatened to slide them all back, but he steadied his footing. "On 3, he gasped. Carmen nodded. The father winced but gave a feeble nod too. 1, 2, 3. They heaved together. The father cried out as weight pressed on his injured leg, but they managed to haul him up onto the path's relatively even ground. Rain hammered them mercilessly, and wind rattled the foliage. Yet for one fleeting instant, Donovan felt a surge of triumph. The man was safe on level ground. Well, safer than before. Carmen exhaled a shaky breath, blinking water from her eyes. I didn't know if anyone would come. She looked at Donovan, raw relief flooding her features. He gave her a quick once-over, checking for obvious injuries. She seemed intact, though drenched and trembling. Thank God I found you, he managed, voice thick. We have to get everyone to the lounge. The generator's dead, but we've got some shelter. Carmen nodded, turning back to help the mother calm the frightened child. His ankle might be broken, she said grimly, gesturing to the father. Donovan pressed his lips together. We'll do a makeshift carry. We're not far from the main building. He reached under the father's arm again. Carmen did the same on the other side, while the mother took hold of the child's hand. It was a painfully slow process, each step accompanied by the father's ragged breaths. Yet step by step, they moved forward. The child whimpered at the thunder, hiding his face in the crook of his mother's elbow. Carmen's expression grew resolute, her entire being set on guiding them to safety. Despite the rain lashing his face, Donovan felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. He and Carmen were battered, hearts pounding, half strangers in the eyes of the island's guests. Yet together, they formed an unspoken bond, a determination to protect these people no matter the storm's wrath. Lightning streaked overhead again, illuminating the path ahead. With the father supported between them, Donovan and Carmen navigated the final stretch down the ridge, mud sucking at their shoes. Each footfall felt precarious. The mother clung to her child, forging onward. In the flashes of light, Donovan caught glimpses of Carmen's dark hair plastered to her cheeks, her eyes focused intently on each step. She looked exhausted but unyielding, so different from the timid maid who had first greeted him. As they descended, a deep rumble of thunder rolled overhead, rattling the island like a giant's roar. Neither Donovan nor Carmen let it slow them. They pressed on, unity forged in adversity, until at last the silhouette of the main building rose before them, a battered shape in the swirling night. The lounge entrance beckoned, a flicker of lantern light barely visible. Donovan gritted his teeth, one more surge of effort. Around them the storm raged, but together they hauled the wounded father and his frightened family those final yards, refusing to yield until they were all safely inside. And in that final push, Donovan felt the raw, beating pulse of life itself, a shared triumph over the darkness. He spared a glance at Carmen, whose gaze met his with a fierce mix of relief and gratitude. They were cold, soaked, and exhausted. Yet for a moment, Donovan's heart soared with something like hope. They had found each other again in the eye of the storm. They had saved these people from disaster's brink. What came next, once they were inside and the true test of survival began, remained uncertain. But for the first time in too long, Donovan believed that even amidst chaos, there was a chance for redemption, for the island's rescue, and for healing the unspoken wounds in his own heart. Carmen and Donovan half-carried, half-walked the injured father through the battered entrance of the staff lounge. Behind them, the mother clutched her young son's trembling hand. Lightning flared outside one last time before they managed to shut the door with a heavy thud, plunging everyone into a close darkness broken only by the ragged glow of a single lantern. Inside, a chorus of gasps and relief rippled among those already sheltered in the basement lounge. Karen and Noah hurried forward, exclaiming at the sight of the new arrivals. The small daughter of the kitchen staff couple peered wide-eyed over the top of a blanket, her curiosity momentarily replacing her fear. Water dripped from everyone's clothing, creating a spreading puddle on the cracked linoleum. Thunder pulsed overhead, and the wind found its way through cracks and seams in the walls. But here, at least, they were together. Donovan's chest rose and fell with the exertion of having climbed the ridge, found Carmen, and returned, all while supporting the father's dead weight on his shoulder. Carmen was breathing hard too, hair clinging to her cheeks. She tried to push it aside, but the wet strands resisted. Despite the exhaustion, her eyes still shone with that fierce determination. "Over here!" Karen called, waving them toward a makeshift seating area on some stacked blankets and pillows. "We can lay him down. Check the injury." Working as one, Donovan and Carmen guided the father down, letting him recline with his injured leg extended. His wife knelt beside him, still clutching their child, whose whimpering had softened into subdued sniffles. Noah rummaged among the supplies for a first aid kit, while the kitchen staff family offered more blankets to cushion the floor. As soon as they could, Donovan and Carmen stepped back, giving the family space. Every muscle in Donovan's arms and back ached from bracing against the storm. His heart, still hammering, told him it was a miracle they'd made it back at all. Bungalow 10 had been so exposed to the gale that it was a wonder the building was still intact. He shot a sidelong glance at Carmen, who was wiping her damp face with the edge of an old towel someone handed her. Dark shadows clung under her eyes, evidence of fatigue and worry. Yet there was an unspoken aura about her, relief at having succeeded, gratitude that neither of them had been lost in the darkness. The father let out a low groan, drawing everyone's attention. He tried to shift, but the movement made him grimace. His wife squeezed his hand. "We fell. He fell when that big palm crashed behind us. He twisted his ankle so badly, probably more than twisted," Carmen said quietly, moving closer to inspect. She knelt, shining a small flashlight over the man's swollen ankle, now turned at an unnatural angle. He sucked in a breath, biting his lip to stifle a cry. Donovan crouched beside her. "Broken?" Carmen's brow furrowed, her gentle fingers probing near the swollen area. "Could be a fracture. I'm no doctor, but it's definitely not just a sprain." She paused, glancing around at the roomful of anxious faces. "We have to keep it immobilized. Does anyone have first aid training?" Karen piped up hesitantly. "I'm a nurse, but in neonatal care, back in the States. I can try to help if you have splints or something to stabilize him." Everyone exchanged glances, searching for the nearest approximation of medical supplies. Eventually, the mother from the kitchen staff rummaged in a battered cabinet along the lounge wall, emerging with a small first aid kit, likely an outdated one from before staff numbers were cut. The best it contained were bandages, gauze, antiseptic, and tape. No real splint. But Karen, the nurse, exhaled in relief. She could at least make do. She fashioned a makeshift brace using a strip of sturdy cardboard from a nearby box, wrapping gauze over it to keep the man's ankle from moving. He winced, sweat beading on his brow, but whispered words of thanks. His wife hovered, softly comforting the child, who clutched at his father's sleeve in mute alarm. All the while, the storm slammed the building. The entire lounge felt as though it might buckle under the sheer force of howling wind. Water trickled from the ceiling in multiple places, collecting into small puddles. The flickering lantern light turned every expression into a canvas of dancing shadows. Donovan surveyed the room, counting the total souls present. The honeymooners, the kitchen staff couple and their daughter, the newly rescued family of 3, Carmen and himself. That made 10 people in total, 10 lives, pinned under a brutal storm with no guarantee of external rescue until the weather relented. Carmen stood slowly from the father's side and returned to Donovan's position by the lounge door. There they eyed each other in the dimness, and it struck him how in just a few days their dynamic had shifted so drastically. She had begun as a reserved housekeeper, quietly apologizing for the manager's failings. Now they shared the weight of leading a crisis. A flicker of something unspoken passed between them, a mutual respect and gratitude, maybe even a bond forged through adversity. "Thank you," she said at last, voice barely audible over the storm's rumble, "for coming to find us. I didn't think you would." Donovan felt a pang, hearing the strain in her tone. "Of course I would." He took a breath, trying to steady the racing in his chest that had nothing to do with physical exertion. "I couldn't sit around waiting, wondering if you were all right." She lowered her gaze. "I was afraid. Not for myself," she added quickly, glancing at the family, "but for them. The father fell so hard and the little boy was screaming. I couldn't leave them behind, but I couldn't move him alone." She let out a trembling breath, as though the enormity of it were just now catching up to her. "I didn't know if I'd be stuck there forever." The raw vulnerability in her confession made Donovan's throat tighten. He reached out, gently resting a hand on her shoulder. "I'd never let that happen." She blinked, as if surprised by the warmth in his words. Then an uncertain smile tugged at her lips. Before she could respond, the building shook again under a new onslaught of wind. A loud creak overhead made them both glance up, tension returning instantly. "We need to reinforce that corner," Noah called from across the lounge. He pointed to where water seeped along a seam in the cinder block wall. The mortar looked cracked, possibly damaged by the persistent water pressure from outside. Carmen squared her shoulders. "Let's see what we can do." She started to cross the room, Donovan right beside her. They discovered that the mortar had begun to flake away, leaving a small gap through which water dribbled. If the storm persisted, that gap might enlarge. Once the flooding pressure built, it could compromise a larger section of the wall. Donovan scanned the scattered supplies, boxes, blankets, furniture. "We can brace it with something heavy on the inside, block the water's path, at least temporarily." Noah sprang into action, helping Donovan and Carmen drag a heavy wooden cabinet from a corner. It scraped across the floor, leaving a wet trail. With considerable effort, they positioned it flush against the wall where the leak trickled in. Carmen grabbed spare towels and wedged them in the gap behind the cabinet, hoping to soak up some of the incoming water. It felt meager, but they had little else to try. Meanwhile, Karen continued tending the father's ankle, softly instructing the mother on how to keep the leg elevated. The child curled up next to them, lulled by his father's presence into a teary exhaustion. The kitchen staff mother offered the family a few cereal bars, urging them to eat and keep their energy up. When the father tried to apologize for being such a burden, the mother gently shushed him, offering a tight-lipped smile. Adversity had a way of forging camaraderie among strangers. In the lull that followed, a collective hush settled over the lounge. Rain hammered the roof, thunder rolled like distant artillery, but for a moment, the group simply breathed in the shared relief of being together. Donovan found himself standing near Carmen, water still dripping from the ends of her ponytail. Their shoulders brushed, and he realized just how small she was compared to him, yet how large her spirit felt. He could sense a subtle trembling in her stance, a mixture of cold, fatigue, and the aftershock of the rescue. He took the initiative, guiding her toward a drier patch of floor near the lounge's center. "You need to rest," he murmured, pulling a blanket from a stack. "You're shivering." She started to protest, but the exhaustion was too evident in her eyes. With a hesitant nod, she sank onto an overturned crate, letting him drape the blanket over her shoulders. As the lantern glow played across her features, Donovan noticed details he hadn't before. The faint freckles across her cheeks, the slight quiver of her lower lip as she tried to maintain composure. She was so young, he realized, yet had carried so much weight for this failing resort, and done so with a courage that left him humbled. "They all need you," she said, voice subdued. "I can't just sit here." "You won't do anyone any good if you collapse," he countered gently. "Believe me, I've learned that the hard way. Pushing yourself too far is a recipe for disaster." For a heartbeat, he thought of his own past. Those countless days he'd worked himself to exhaustion, ignoring his marriage, ignoring the subtle cracks in his relationships. Maybe if he'd paused, recognized his limits, he might not be a divorced man battling guilt while a storm raged on his neglected island. The parallels seemed too pointed to ignore. Carmen's gaze drifted toward the family, then to the others, all huddled in quiet conversation, "This place," she whispered. "It used to be beautiful, really special. Guests would come from around the world, so happy to be here. I'd bring them towels or greet them at check-in, and I'd see such excitement in their faces. But then everything started to break down. The staff left. The manager stopped caring. Budgets got slashed. We tried to keep it running, but every day felt like we were losing pieces of what made this resort special. I didn't think it could get worse, until this storm arrived." Donovan felt an ache in his chest. He settled onto a low stack of blankets beside her crate, leaning in so he wouldn't force her to speak above the roar. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry that it got to this point. He hesitated. Revealing himself as the CEO who had approved the cost cuts might break whatever fragile trust she felt. But she deserved the truth. "Listen, there's something I need you to know. Another crash of thunder rattled the walls, swallowing his words. Carmen peered at him, uncertainty in her dark eyes. Before Donovan could continue, a loud rumbling came from above, followed by a rush of water that spilled in through a fresh crack in the ceiling. The lounge erupted in alarmed shouts. That corner was near the storage room they hadn't checked thoroughly. Voices rose in confusion, water splashing across the floor. Donovan sprang to his feet, all sense of confession lost in the new crisis. "I'll see what's happening," he told Carmen, covering her hand for a moment in a reassuring squeeze. "Stay here." She nodded, tossing the blanket aside, unable to remain idle. Even with exhaustion etched in every line of her body, she stood to help coordinate. Donovan exchanged a flicker of understanding with her. This was bigger than either of them. They had no choice but to fight the storm's newest threat. He strode through the watery gloom, half of him reeling from the sense of something left unfinished in that conversation. For now, though, survival took precedence. The building shook again, a fresh wave of wind roaring past. Through it all, Donovan clung to a renewed sense of purpose. Keep these people safe, save the resort from total ruin, and, somehow, find a way to tell Carmen who he truly was and why it mattered. If they made it through the night, maybe the dawn would bring answers. Until then, the unstoppable storm tested each of them in turn, threatening to drown every hope in darkness. But Donovan Cross had already made one vow to himself in that swirling maelstrom. No matter what it took, he would protect Carmen, these families, and the dream this island once represented. He would not fail again, even if it cost him everything. A fresh torrent of water gushed through the crack in the ceiling, spilling onto the lounge floor and sending the group into renewed alarm. Donovan Cross waded toward the source, stepping around scattered blankets and boxes. His flashlight beam traced the thin fracture where rainwater forced its way through, the steady drip now a stream. The entire building groaned with the strain, as though the storm was testing every bolt and beam. "Over here!" Karen shouted, waving him over. She and Noah were hastily moving chairs and cushions to higher ground, trying to keep them from getting soaked. The honeymooners clutched each other with anxious faces. Across the room, the injured father was wincing, bracing his injured leg while his wife comforted their young son. And in the corner, the kitchen staff family was piling towels on the floor, an increasingly futile attempt to contain the water. Carmen Alvarez joined Donovan near the leak, flashlight in hand. Though fatigue lined her features, she carried herself with unwavering purpose. Rain-soaked strands of hair framed her face. "We need to find something to catch the water," she said, eyes flicking around the lounge. "A bucket. Anything. Before it seeps into the walls and does more damage." Donovan nodded, scanning the dim space until he spotted a large plastic bin by the lounge's storage closet. He yanked it free of stacked linens and dragged it under the dripping leak. Immediately, water began to splash into it with a hollow ping. Another rumble of thunder rolled across the sky, vibrating the air in the basement as if reminding them that the worst might still be out there. "The leak is coming from the storage room's ceiling," Noah said, approaching. He jerked his thumb toward a door set in the side wall. Might be a clogged drain, or maybe the storm tore off part of the roof. Carmen's mouth pressed into a determined line. Then let's see how bad it is. Donovan? Right behind you, he replied. They pressed through the door into a narrow storage room that smelled of old cardboard and mildew. The ceiling here was a patchwork of warped tiles and exposed beams. In the flickering lantern light, they could see water seeping through the seams, collecting on top of a large metal shelf before trickling over the edge to the lounge outside. A section of the ceiling sagged ominously, as if it might collapse at any moment. Careful, Carmen breathed, stepping gingerly. She aimed her flashlight at the weak spot. If that caves in completely, water might flood straight into the lounge. We need a way to redirect it, or brace it, until the storm eases. Donovan reached overhead, pressing on the ceiling tile with cautious fingers. It felt soft, soaked through. A small avalanche of wet plaster dust crumbled onto his sleeve, making him cough. "This is bad," he murmured. "Do we have anything like a tarp or plastic sheeting?" Carmen studied the array of shelves stacked haphazardly with cleaning supplies and out-of-date brochures. "Let's check." They split up, rummaging through piles of junk in the half-darkness, scanning for anything that could help. The storm's howls echoed through the walls, and each thunderclap made the entire structure tremble. At last, Donovan managed to pull a folded plastic drop cloth from beneath a stack of forgotten promotional posters. "This might do," he said, brandishing it. "We can pin it against the ceiling, funnel the water off to one side." Carmen exhaled, relieved. "That's perfect. I'll grab some duct tape if I can find it." They worked in tandem, stretching the plastic sheet under the sagging section, then trying to secure its edges. Water plopped onto Donovan's shoulder as he lifted his arms overhead. Carmen did her best to wipe the surface dry enough for tape to stick. It was an imperfect solution. Water still found ways to dribble around the edges, but it helped direct the worst of the flow into a corner where they placed another bin to catch it. The ceiling groaned as they finished, but it held. Stepping back, they regarded their makeshift handiwork. Even as the water continued to drip from the plastic into the bin, they both recognized that any improvement was better than nothing. They shared a look, exhausted but hopeful. The storm had battered them all night, and it wasn't over, but at least they were holding the line. A loud crash from the lounge startled them. Carmen yelped, and Donovan spun, adrenaline spiking. They rushed back through the door, half expecting the wall to have caved in or the door to have blown open again. Instead, they found Karen and Noah near the lounge entrance, hurriedly dragging pieces of a broken wooden shelf out of the path. It seemed the old cabinet propped against the leak-prone wall had shifted, tumbling part of its contents. The group quickly tidied the debris, no serious harm done. With the crisis contained, if only temporarily, Donovan collapsed onto a nearby crate, shoulders sagging. Carmen sank onto an overturned plastic bin, inhaling sharply as though every muscle in her body ached. The lounge had become a patchwork of makeshift solutions, bins catching leaks, towels lining cracks, blankets covering shivering bodies. They were surviving minute by minute. "Has the storm weakened at all?" The question came from the injured father, whose voice trembled. His leg, stabilized by Karen's improvised splint, was elevated on a stack of pillows. Carmen glanced at Donovan, as if silently urging him to deliver some optimism. He swallowed, listening for any sign of lessening wind or softer rain, but the steady drone of the downpour and the whistle of gale-force gusts persisted. He couldn't lie to the man. "Not by much," he admitted gently. "We might be in for a few more hours of this." A hush followed. The child next to him sniffled, rubbing tired eyes. The mother wrapped an arm around her, murmuring reassurances. Carmen cleared her throat, forcing a calm tone. "We'll be okay," she said, louder for everyone to hear. "We're together, and we've made it this far." Karen and Noah, seated near the door, both nodded, though worry lingered in their eyes. The kitchen staff father offered a weary smile. "We'll take turns. If another leak pops up, we'll fix it. If anyone needs anything, just say." A sense of collective resolve settled in the lounge. Donovan realized with a pang that in all his years of managing luxury resorts, he'd rarely seen such community spirit. People who had arrived as strangers were now relying on each other like family. The storm stripped away the usual walls of formality and decorum, revealing how much they needed one another. Exhaustion prowled like a heavy predator on Donovan's shoulders. It must have been close to midnight, or perhaps well past, but no one dared guess how much longer the tempest would rage. Eyes drooped, limbs trembled. He glanced at Carmen, noticing her deep fatigue. For a moment, he wrestled with whether to insist she try to sleep. But she was already busy, crossing to the mother with a murmured offer to help coax the frightened child to eat some cereal bars. The lounge's lantern sputtered, its flame dancing dangerously low. Karen hurried to adjust the wick, carefully conserving fuel. In the flickering semi-darkness, Donovan surveyed the ragtag group. Each face bore the marks of stress, yet each also shone with a flicker of determination. They had come this far, they wouldn't give up. He found himself drifting toward Carmen, as if guided by an invisible thread. She stood by the corner with the mother and the little boy, patting the child's back. Her murmur was gentle, but Donovan didn't intrude on their words. Instead, he observed Carmen's compassion. A wave of gratitude washed over him. She had put the well-being of the entire island ahead of her own safety, from the moment he arrived. For that, he owed her more than he could ever express. At last, the child yawned, leaning against his mother, who smiled weakly at Carmen in thanks. With the boy calmer, Carmen inched away, her gaze finding Donovan's. In the lantern glow, her expression held a mix of relief and exhaustion. "You should try to rest," he said quietly but firmly. The distant boom of thunder underscored his words. "I'll keep watch for leaks or any new problems." She hesitated, then pressed her lips together. "I should say the same to you." He allowed a faint smile. "We can take turns." The building rattled under another wind gust and Carmen's knuckles tightened around the flashlight. She exhaled shakily. "I'm not sure if I can sleep," she admitted. "Every time the wind howls, I think the roof's about to rip off. This used to be such a solid place. I can't believe it's come to this." Donovan gently touched her shoulder, drawing her gaze. "I know," he murmured, "but you've done everything possible. If this island makes it through the storm, it'll be because of you." She swallowed, face shadowed in conflicting emotions. Then, in a quiet tone, she asked the question that had been lingering. "Donovan, earlier, you said there was something I needed to know." He felt his chest tighten, recalling that interrupted moment when he'd tried to confess who he really was. Outside, the storm raged, yet here in the lounge, time seemed to slow. Everyone else was too busy or too tired to pay attention to their private exchange. He ran a hand through his damp hair, words struggling in his throat. Yes. Carmen, I'm not just a guest." He paused, aware of how her brows knitted in curiosity. "You see, I own this resort. Or more accurately, I'm the CEO of the company that does, Cross Global Hospitality." For an instant she blinked, uncomprehending. Then her face shifted, realization blooming. "You're the Donovan Cross? The man who—" His stomach churned, unsure what reaction he'd see. Anger, betrayal, disappointment. "Yes," he said quietly. "I came here to check on things after my divorce. I honestly thought I was coming for a quiet escape, but seeing the resort in disarray, I have no excuses. My decisions have contributed to the lack of funding, the staff shortage. I approved cost cuts, trusting the local manager would handle them responsibly. Clearly that didn't happen." Carmen's eyes glistened with surprise and something akin to hurt. "You let the place fall apart." She spoke softly, not to accuse but as if piecing the puzzle together. "And yet, you've been here, rescuing us. Why didn't you say something sooner?" He exhaled, shoulders slumping. At first, I guess I was ashamed. I didn't realize how bad things had gotten under that manager. Then the storm hit, and everything spiraled. I didn't want to lose the trust we had. Now it feels like a coward's move to stay silent. Silence throbbed between them, broken only by distant thunder. Carmen's expression flickered. Anger, surprise, relief, betrayal, each crossing her features in rapid succession. Finally, she let out a shaky laugh tinged with disbelief. "You're the boss of it all, and yet you've been here, climbing ridges, hauling people to safety, patching roofs." He almost smiled, but guilt pricked him. "I haven't been a very good boss, have I? I've neglected my responsibilities, and it's cost this resort, and you, so much." Carmen searched his face, swallowing hard. The staff left because they lost faith. They believed no one cared anymore, that the higher-ups only saw numbers, not people. She paused, voice hitching. "But if we do get through this, can you promise things will change?" His gaze flicked to the battered lounge, the people huddled in fear, the child's tear-streaked face. He didn't hesitate. "I promise," he said, voice firm. "I'll fix what's broken, starting with this island, and His throat constricted. "I won't run away again." Carmen's eyes glimmered with a wet sheen, whether from tears or just fatigue he wasn't sure. She inhaled deeply, then nodded. A single tear escaped down her cheek, quickly brushed aside. "All right," she said, quiet but resolute. "Then let's survive this storm and rebuild, together." A brittle tension in Donovan's chest loosened, replaced by a cautious warmth. He offered a weary smile. "Together," he echoed. In that moment, a flash of lightning bled through the cracks of the basement windows, illuminating the room. It revealed not just the battered walls and dripping ceilings, but the determined faces of people banded by adversity. Donovan caught Carmen's gaze, and something unspoken passed between them, a resolve to trust, a glimmer of hope. Outside, the wind still howled, and the rain pummeled the island. But within the flickering lantern light, Donovan Cross and Carmen Alvarez found something stronger than the storm, a common cause, a promise of renewal, and perhaps the first stirrings of a bond that neither the broken ceilings nor the howling gusts could tear apart. Night pressed on with unrelenting darkness, each thunderclap a jarring reminder of the storm's unyielding wrath. And yet, in the flickering lantern glow of the basement lounge, the smallest ember of hope began to glimmer. Donovan Cross and Carmen Alvarez, along with the handful of guests and staff, formed a circle of quiet determination. They whispered among themselves, comforting the frightened children, passing out what remained of the cereal bars, and tending to the injured father. Every so often the ceiling above groaned or water would burst through a new crack, prompting them to leap into action with buckets and towels. But slowly, painstakingly, they found a rhythm in the chaos. As the long hours crept by, exhaustion pushed many to a threshold beyond which they could not stay awake. The mother of the injured father slumped against the wall with her dozing child in her lap. Karen and Noah dozed in short, fitful spells, rousing each time thunder bellowed close. The kitchen staff parents, despite their nerves, alternated watch duty with Donovan, patrolling the lounge to check for new leaks. Their young daughter curled up in a nest of towels, lulled at last by the storm's monotonous roar. Carmen had promised to rest, but Donovan found her standing near one of the narrow basement windows, peering out into the swirling void. Rain spattered the glass, glinting like shards of silver in the sporadic lightning flashes. She stood perfectly still, shoulders trembling in an almost imperceptible shiver. He approached quietly, mindful not to startle her, though she sensed his presence and turned with tired eyes. "You should try to sleep," he said, echoing the advice he'd given her hours before. She gave a faint shake of her head. "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back outside, fighting the wind, worried that something worse might still happen." Her voice faltered for a moment, then steadied. What if the walls give way? What if the roof collapses? Donovan studied the shadows under her eyes, the tension in her posture. We'll deal with it together if it does. His voice was gentle but resolute. And if the worst comes, I promise I won't let you face it alone. A fragile smile ghosted across Carmen's lips. For a moment, there was a flicker of something more. An unspoken closeness formed by their ordeal. Then the building shook with another thunderous blow. They instinctively braced themselves against the wall. When the tremor passed, Carmen exhaled shakily. I think the storm's beginning to shift, she murmured, nodding at the window. The wind patterns feel different. Donovan paused, listening. Indeed, the gusts that had once screamed with savage intensity now sounded more like a deep, steady drone, still violent, but not as frenzied. Could it be the eye of the storm? Or perhaps the system was finally passing overhead? We should be careful, he warned. Sometimes when the eye moves over, the weather calms briefly, only to roar back twice as fierce. Carmen nodded. I know. They continued their quiet vigil. Time blurred, the minutes vanishing into a strange mixture of watchful anxiety and hesitant hope. Some people managed to doze, stirring only when water dripped somewhere new. Others stared into space or exchanged whispered reassurances. Eventually, Karen perked up and reported that the barometer in her phone's emergency app showed a rising pressure, though the phone itself was out of battery soon after. It was a tiny sign that maybe, just maybe, the storm's center was moving on. A subdued hush settled over the lounge. Rain still pummeled the roof, but the screaming wind lessened by a small yet discernible measure. Donovan, still pacing in slow circles around the lounge, paused as he caught an odd rumble, deeper than thunder, more constant. He tilted his head, trying to discern it through the pounding in his ears. Carmen joined him, straining to listen. Then, like a signal from another world, came a burst of static. It crackled from the walkie-talkie that lay silent for hours on the lounge table. Carmen darted over, snatching it up, eyes wide. "Hello?" she said, breath catching. "This is Carmen, Paradise Bay Resort. Is anyone there?" A garbled voice fought through the interference. "Heading your way. Weather window. Hold tight." The words were faint and clipped by static, but enough came through to spark a wave of relief. Rescue was possible. A hush followed as the signal faded again, but the meaning was clear. Donovan's chest flooded with gratitude. He turned to find Carmen staring at him, eyes shining in the lantern light. "They're coming for us," she whispered, almost disbelieving. He nodded, a smile tugging at his mouth. "They're at least trying. That means the worst of the storm might be letting up. If they can get a boat or plane in soon..." Her shoulders relaxed visibly, and some of the tension in the lounge melted away as words spread among the group. People embraced loved ones, tears mingling with tired laughter. For the first time since the night began, real hope glimmered, like a tiny spark fending off the darkness. Still, caution prevailed. The hours that followed were a slow, uneasy wait. The wind relented in degrees, though stray gusts still rattled the building. Rain pounded on, but the thunder's voice grew distant. Dawn's pale light eventually seeped into the basement windows, revealing a world in tatters. From their vantage they saw battered palm fronds lying in sodden heaps, the courtyard partially flooded. At one point, a final volley of thunder boomed, more an echo than a direct threat. By mid-morning, the storm had degraded into a heavy tropical squall. Donovan and Carmen, leading a small recon team, Noah and the kitchen staff father, ventured cautiously upstairs to assess the damage. It was sobering. The main floor had puddles in every corridor, shattered windows letting in the humid, salty breeze. The once pristine reception hall was a wreck. Soggy rugs, overturned furniture, a portion of the thatched roof collapsed. Outside, debris littered the walkways. Yet the structure still stood. Noah climbed a short flight of steps to see if any vantage gave a glimpse of approaching rescue craft. The ocean glimmered through the parted clouds, still rough but no longer monstrous. Waves lapped at the beach, strewn with flotsam. The path from the boat dock was blocked by fallen palms, rendering it impassable. Another staff boat was nowhere in sight, presumably lost or damaged by the gale. But in the distance, just near the horizon, he thought he spotted a faint shape, possibly a patrol vessel. "Donovan!" he called. "I think they're out there!" Donovan scaled the vantage to see for himself. Sure enough, a small vessel, a rescue boat or a Coast Guard cutter, was inching closer, battling the leftover swells. He felt relief surge through him. They had made contact after all. Now the battered residents of the basement lounge might truly have a way off the island. He returned to the basement to share the news. Cheering broke out, subdued but joyful, as the group realized rescue was imminent. Carmen closed her eyes for a moment, silently thanking whatever higher powers guided them. The father with the broken ankle clutched his wife's hand, murmuring about how they'd soon get real medical attention. The honeymooners hugged each other in tearful relief. Still, an enormous task lay ahead. The rescue boat couldn't land on a battered dock or wade through debris by itself. Everyone had to gather their strength, clear the path if possible, or find a safe vantage point for an airlift if a helicopter came instead. Donovan mustered what remained of his energy, organizing a small work team to remove fallen palm trunks and debris. He felt Carmen at his side, unwavering. When their eyes met, a silent understanding passed between them. They weren't done yet, but they were close. Hour by hour, they chipped away at the destruction. One group cleared the main walkway. Another tried to salvage what remained of the dinghy near the beach. Alas, it was too damaged to float. Through it all, the guests and staff cooperated like old friends, forging bonds of necessity. Karen checked on the injured father, ensuring his splint was still secure. Noah and Donovan hefted branches aside. Carmen led the kitchen staff couple in collecting scattered supplies that might be needed once the rescuers arrived. Everyone paused occasionally to gulp fresh air and marvel that the storm was, at long last, subsiding into memory. Late afternoon brought a break in the clouds, revealing patches of blue overhead. The ocean, once furious, now rolled in broad, foamy swells. On the horizon, a rescue vessel drew nearer. Soon they spotted a smaller motor launch peeling away from the larger ship, carefully navigating the debris-laden waters. The group at the beach flagged it down with bright cloth, shouting and waving. As the boat approached, uniformed personnel aboard shouted that they were here to evacuate any injured and assess the situation. It was a scene of cautious jubilation. The father with the broken ankle was carried aboard first, accompanied by his grateful wife and child. The honeymooners followed, their eyes shining with relief. The kitchen staff family joined them, though they lingered to ensure the last of the supplies, food, water, a few personal belongings, were accounted for. Carmen and Donovan worked side by side, helping the rescuers, hands caked with mud and eyes alight with victory. The resort might be battered beyond measure, but the people were safe, and in that, they found all the meaning they needed. As the final pair to board, Donovan and Carmen stepped onto the rocking motor launch. Before them, the shattered remains of the once luxurious resort lay against the battered palm groves, a testament to the storm's fury and to years of mismanagement. Yet in Carmen's eyes, Donovan saw resilience and determination. They had survived. The larger rescue ship welcomed them with urgent calls for medical triage and space to rest. Everyone found seats or cots, distributing blankets and offering each other water. The hum of the boat's engines reverberated underfoot. It was an odd sensation after so long fighting the howling wind on land, a sense of departure from the place of trauma. Donovan, though, felt no real sense of farewell. Something in him declared that the island's story wasn't over. He reached for Carmen, guiding her to a quiet corner away from the bustle of medics. She leaned against a railing, hair still damp, face etched with exhaustion. Yet when she turned to Donovan, there was a brightness in her gaze, a fragile, cautious hope. "So," she said quietly, "what now?" He looked at the battered shoreline in the distance, remembering her vow to rebuild the resort. He recalled his own promise to fix what was broken, to no longer be the absentee CEO. "I'm not abandoning it," he replied, voice steady. "I'll gather the resources, hire new staff, pay them fairly, everything we should have done before. We'll make it better than it ever was." Carmen released a soft breath of relief. She hesitated, then asked, "And me? Where do I fit in?" He smiled gently. "Wherever you want. If you'll stay on, we'll need leaders, people who know the island, who care about it. You've proven your heart for this place. I'd be honored if you'd be part of that future, in a bigger role." Her cheeks warmed. A moment passed, the boat rocking beneath them. Perhaps months ago, she would have doubted the sincerity of such an offer. Now, she believed him. "I'd like that," she said softly. "We still have a lot to do, but yeah, we can rebuild." Donovan nodded, a sense of conviction filling his chest. He recalled their first meeting, her shy apology, the awkwardness of him appearing as just another guest. It felt like a lifetime ago, overshadowed by the night's tribulations. Yet those trials had forged a trust that might not have grown otherwise. A sudden wave jostled the boat, but he steadied himself, placing a hand lightly on Carmen's arm. Their gazes met in that moment, the hush of the rescue operation around them fading. Despite his every impulse to keep distance, to preserve the professional lines, he realized that a deeper thread connected them, one shaped by acts of courage, empathy, and survival. A thread that could not be easily dismissed. He parted his lips, unsure how to phrase what churned inside his heart. But Carmen's small, almost imperceptible nod told him she understood, even if the words went unspoken. Her hand rose, touching his gently. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. His response was almost as soft. "Thank you." And with that, they stood quietly against the railing, watching the island recede as the rescue vessel carried them over restless seas. The wind now felt gentle, the rain reduced to a whisper. Though battered, the island lingered on the horizon, a place in need of restoration, much like Donovan himself. In time, both would heal. And the maid who had once merely turned down bed linens for him was now the one who had held his heart captive amid the raging storm, reminding him of what truly mattered: people, compassion, and the faith that even in the darkest tempest, new beginnings could be forged. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.